So this is take 2 of this video because I just recorded the entire video without my mic on, somehow. So, here we are, again, I guess. Ladies, gentlemen, and other delightful beings, both living and unliving, let's talk mummies. They've existed for thousands of years, and they're the relics of a time long past, preserved in the arid embrace of the Egyptian desert, where the sun beats down with a relentless heat, and the air is thick with the scent of dusty sand and ancient oils. Mummies are the evidence of the deep care and devotion that those in ancient Egypt held for their dead, a beautiful example of a culture's foray into the belief of life after death. The faint rustle of papyrus whispers secrets of their rituals, and the aroma of myrrh and frankincense hangs heavily in the air, evoking a sacredness around their practices. And, oh, what's that I'm hearing? Ah, Victorians used to grind them up and make them into paint, and eat them. Yep, that's right. Today we're talking about mummy brown. If you've been on this channel in the past, you might have heard me mention this extremely rare and controversial color. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the history of mummy brown, as well as the horrors that are woven throughout that history. And at the end, we'll be investigating some mysterious, unlabeled 200-year-old pigments from the 1840s to see if any of them could be the legendary mummy brown. Let's go. Insert trigger warning here. To discuss mummy brown, we first need to talk about the origins of Europe's fascination with mummies, and that begins with a substance known as bitumen. Bitumen, also known as pitch, asphalt, or asphaltum, is a natural byproduct of the fossil fuel petroleum. It comes in 2 different forms, depending on the conditions it's surrounded by. First, it can appear as a sticky, gooey substance that smells like you left a raw egg in the back of a diesel truck for a few years, or second, as this. A light resinous material reminiscent of those plastic gems you sometimes get as little prizes at fairs or arcades or stuff like that. This sumptuous black plasticky stuff was an important part of societies like ancient Greece and Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. And it was used by different cultures worldwide for basically everything, from being a fuel for lamps, to mortar in construction, to waterproofing boats and ships, to a medical treatment for all kinds of wounds and diseases. Flash forward a little over 1,000 years, and as the 11th century unfolded, European soldiers embarked on their fateful invasions of the Middle East during the First Crusades. Amidst the clamor of battle, whispers of a wondrous black medicine, believed to have been wielded by the ancient Greeks for the healing of broken bones and torn organs, permeated their ranks. This rather mythical introduction of bitumen sparked an unprecedented surge in its allure throughout medieval Europe, and following the Crusades, bitumen quickly gained popularity. This black resiny stuff was now a go-to treatment in medieval medicine, sold in apothecaries as a sort of miracle drug. Think of it like the essential oils of the era. And it was used for everything from broken bones. It was used for everything from broken bones. And it was used for everything from healing broken bones to curing tuberculosis, to getting rid of worms, to getting more of that vitamin D. Sometime in the 12th century, things reached a fever pitch. This is that infamous moment that everything had all led up to. The birth of a misconception that would echo through centuries to come. You see, bitumen, being a byproduct of a fossil fuel, was a quickly shrinking resource. No modern commentary needed there, is it, folks? But wouldn't you know it, there was a new rumor floating around. Whispers spread through towns and trading posts, igniting imaginations and fueling a frenzy for the new exotic source of the precious black resin. People had recently discovered quite a few graves in Egypt filled with preserved remains, and speculation abounded. The blackened appearance of these corpses was mistakenly linked to the idea that their ancient caregivers had used bitumen in the embalming and wrapping processes. Bitumen, otherwise known in Persia as mum or mumia. This was, of course, absolute nonsense. Bitumen has never been used in mummification, as far as we can tell. However, they sure didn't know that in the 1200s, and so the rumor took on a life of its own, sparking an insatiable demand for mummified remains. The mummified bodies were quickly adopted as a suitable substitute for bitumen, and hence the bitumen-looking people powder became known as Mumia. Mumia became mummy. Yep, mummies got their name through a case of mistaken identity. In their quest for status and wealth, traders would make the argument that the resin scraped off a mummified corpse contained miraculous properties, linking it to longevity and health. Apothecaries began to sell mumia, which was now not a fossil fuel byproduct, but instead literal ground-up human, as a cure-all.
That is called cannibalism, my dear children, and is in fact frowned upon in most societies.
Thus, mummies became less human and more commodity in medieval Europe. And unfortunately, it would only get worse. Fast forward a bit, the year is 1798, and Napoleon Bonaparte, future Emperor of France, has begun campaigns in Syria and Egypt, driven by a desire to expand France's economic interests through lucrative trade routes, bolster political power by securing alliances with local leaders, and enhance France's general prestige through scientific advancement. All that great stuff that falls under the umbrella of European imperialism. It was on this campaign that our man Napoleon got stoned. And by that, I mean that his men discovered the Rosetta Stone, an incredibly important contribution to understanding several languages that had, until now, been impossible to decipher. Oh, what's that you say? It's a couple of years later, and the Rosetta Stone has sparked absolute Egyptomania. Suddenly, Egypt and its exotic allure are everywhere in Europe, especially in the UK, where English people are importing and literally unwrapping mummies with all the care and delicacy of a youngest child ripping into presents on Christmas morning. Yeah, mummy unwrapping parties are now a thing, and it's just as bad as it sounds. Dead guy! But Egyptomania brought much more than just mummy unwrapping parties to the culture of Victorian Europe. In fact, ancient Egypt permeated pretty much every aspect of Victorian life, from architecture to clothing and jewelry to literature and art. And what do you do when you have a booming influx of not only priceless antiques and artifacts, but thousands of ancient embalmed corpses? Well, you make them into paint, apparently. Now, there are several important ingredients to make mummy brown, although I would highly recommend that you not make mummy brown. The first of these ingredients is mummies. I would hope this one is a no-brainer. On a related note, brains of those being mummified were often pulled out via the nose and literally thrown away. The second ingredient was white pitch, a pine resin that was probably added as a stabilizer and a preservative. The last ingredient was myrrh, which has been used for thousands of years to disguise foul-smelling things. The potpourri of ancient times, if you will. And it was likely to mask the scent of, well, the mummies, which was apparently quite pungent. Take, for example, this account from 1809 that British chemist George Field recorded about his experience receiving a shipment of mummified remains for the sole purpose of making mummy brown pigment. Field described the delivery as a mass containing and permeating rib bone, etc., of a strong smell resembling garlic and ammonia, grinds easily, works rather pasty, unaffected by damp and foul air. Fun. Essentially, the process of making the mummy brown itself wasn't too time-consuming. The ingredients were taken, ground up, and molded into paint much like any other pigment. And although the process of making it is pretty straightforward, it's the timeline of mummy-based paint where things start to get a bit fuzzy. Leathery? When it comes to the birth of mummy brown, historians aren't certain who first thought of making mummies into paint. Technically, we have an art treatise from De Arte Pigendi, written by Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo in 1584, that states that mummies were being ground up and used as not just medicine, but paint as early as the 12th century, way back in the time of the Crusades. But however long it goes back, mummy brown paints really started to shoot up in popularity in the 1700s, less than 100 years before the explosion of Egyptomania in Victorian Europe. For instance, in the lively streets of Paris, circa 1712, an art supply shop emerged with the whimsical and macabre name à la Mumia. This establishment catered to the creative souls of the time by offering not only the traditional acrylics and varnishes, but also the more exotic powdered mummy, alongside the aromatic wares of incense and myrrh. It was a curious fusion of artistry and antiquity, where the echoes of ancient Egypt mingled with the vibrant aspirations of burgeoning French artists, inviting them to conjure landscapes and portraits imbued with the mystique of the past. The allure of paint made from mummies would only grow, seeming to reach its peak with the pre-Raphaelite painters of the mid-1800s. The pre-Raphaelites were a brotherhood of painters famous for their intensely realistic, yet fantastical and mystical works, inspired by both history and myth. These painters were sensitive and devoted, and the delicate layers of vivid color made their paintings renowned for possessing a jewel-like quality. With such a strong connection to mysticism and history, it makes sense that Mummy Brown seemed to cater to these artists' artistic souls, infused as it was with the essence of ancient civilizations. This unique pigment not only contributed a rich color to their palettes, but also served as a medium through which they could explore themes of life, death, and the eternal. Although good intentions can't undo ethical wrongs, and I hope we can all agree that grinding up human remains and using them for paint is ethically dubious at best, it's crucial to recognize that many artists remained oblivious to the fact that this paint was literally made from mummies. You could say that they were in denial. One famous and heartbreaking example is Edward Burne-Jones, who, upon discovering the nature of Mummy Brown, was devastated, to the extent that he held a small and respectful burial for his tube of Mummy Brown, burying it in his flower garden outside of his house. His nephew would later report, "He descended in broad daylight with a tube of Mummy Brown in his hand, saying that he had discovered it was made of dead pharaohs, and we must bury it accordingly. So we all went out and helped, according to the rites of Mizraim and Memphis, I hope, and to this day I could drive a spade within a foot of where that tube lies." As easy as it is to judge those in the past by modern standards, it's crucial to remember that during this time, people often couldn't access any knowledge of the ingredients in the candies they bought, much less the paints they used. Keeping this in mind really highlights just how secretive, unethical, and downright horrifying the production of Mummy Brown truly was behind the scenes. Alright, bear with me, because things are about to get pretty heavy for a minute. Don't worry, it won't be for too long, but before we get to the downfall of Mummy Brown, we need to pull back the curtain on some of the horrors that surrounded its production. We've addressed the obvious one. Mummified remains are people. Before they died, they lived full and complex lives. These people were someone's child, someone's grandfather, someone's lover, someone's best friend that they had inside jokes with. If you can't understand the moral wrongness of using mummified remains as paint, I need you to imagine how you would feel if, years in the future, someone dug down into the ground and unearthed that modest, yet lovingly embellished casket that you picked out for your sibling, grandmother, or significant other. They would extract their preserved body, or ashes, and put them into various heavy machinery, transforming them into something that someone could buy in the arts and crafts aisle of Hobby Lobby for less than the cost of a throw pillow. If you didn't get it already, I hope you get it now. And I hate to say it, but it gets worse. Obviously, the mummies that were turned into paint weren't treated with any sort of respect or delicacy. And inevitably, abuse emerged in the mummy trade as the availability of genuine ancient mummies dwindled. To meet the rising demand, suppliers began using the corpses of condemned criminals and slaves. In his history, Pettigrew, a prominent physician and expert mummy unwrapper, details the investigation conducted by French physician Guy de la Fontaine in Alexandria around 1835. he discovered that the head mummy dealer's stock was significantly supplemented with the bodies of recently deceased individuals, often executed criminals or slaves, by treating them with bitumen and sun exposure, resulting in mummified tissue that was sold as authentic Mumia. Pettigrew also recounts an encounter with one merchant who, when asked how the people had died, replied that he cared not where the bodies came from, be it old or young, male or female, or their cause of death, so long as he could acquire them, stating that once embalmed, no one could tell. Yikes! Don't worry though, eventually with the help of bad press, artists and concerned citizens pushing for higher ethical standards with the treatment of mummified remains, and frankly, the fact that the paint producers just plain started running out of mummies, Mummy Brown declined in popularity by the end of the 1800s, and no more authentic Mummy Brown was produced after the year 1964. So, yeah. Although most paint companies stopped making Mummy Brown by the early 1900s, the paint company C. Robertson apparently still made it up till 1964. That year, in an interview with Time magazine, C. Robertson's managing director, Geoffrey Robertson Park, expressed that we might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but not enough to make any more paint. Thus ended the story of Mummy Brown, much more recently than most people realize. In fact, Mummy Brown was officially discontinued the same decade as mankind's first journeys into space. In the grand scheme of things, that's not that long ago. If there's one thing that we can take away from the history of Mummy Brown, it's the importance of considering the ethical implications of the things that we buy, use, and consume. After all, we have a lot more knowledge about where the things we buy come from and how they're produced than the Victorians did. Although its story is an insane and at times heartbreaking one, Mummy Brown is an important part of not just art history, but the history of humanity. I think most people have this desire to be a part of something important, part of a bigger picture. I think a lot of artists found that bigger picture in the awe that came with Mummy Brown and Egyptomania. That being said, I find it hard to believe that any of the Egyptian people who were turned into mummies and then paint wanted to be part of a bigger picture quite as literally as things turned out. So as we handle these kinds of unusual situations and subjects, I would encourage all of my viewers to see the nuances of humanity in both the artists of that time and the people and cultures who were robbed and wronged to make this part of art history. Art and history are all about nuance, and as we try and pick out and understand these nuances, we'll better understand not just art history, but also ourselves. You didn't think I'd leave you hanging, did you? Okay, so here are two of the bottles that I recently acquired from Pennsylvania that are dated to about the 1840s, which should be the prime time of Mummy Brown. Now, full disclosure, for the sake of respect, I'm actually not even going to be mulling these pigments, just taking the smallest amount possible that I can and gently mixing it with a tiny bit of oil so that we can see what it looks like on a paper. And so I'm just mixing them both with a tiny amount of walnut oil so that they're thinned down enough so that we can see the undertones, and then we're going to swatch them. Now, I will say that Mummy Brown is famous for having a very particular smell. I did notice a faint smell from the one on the left of the palette, but I didn't notice anything from the one on the right. I'm not sure what that's about, but when I swatched them out and compared them to the original Mummy Brown, I don't know, guys. In my personal opinion, I don't think either one of these are Mummy Brown, but who knows? It's hard to tell without getting extensive chemical tests. Thank you so much to my patrons for supporting me in this video. If you'd like to join my Patreon, the link is in my description, and I would absolutely love to have you join our weird art history family over there. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching and brushing up on art history with me. I hope that you have an incredible day. I'll see you next time. So, to discuss Mummy Brown, we first must examine the origins... the oranges! Ah, the oranges of Europe.